Hello and welcome to the ILC Daily Show. I'm Sophie Fisher. We're coming to you live today from Geneva and Bangkok. I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Needham. Steve is our Senior Regional Communication Officer for Asia and the Pacific. Steve, hi, how are things? I hope all's well in Bangkok.
Hi, Sophie. Yeah, it's great to be with you here again. Everything is great here in Bangkok. Just to remind everybody watching, you can also see us live on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Please join us on any of those platforms. Interpretation of the show is also available in both French and Spanish.
Thanks, Steve. Yep, it's great to see so many people joining us today. And we also want to hear from you. We're taking your questions during the show and we'll be putting them to our experts. Today, we'll be looking at how we can build back better. As you know, COVID-19 has made existing inequalities worse. So we need recovery policies that boost equality, including for the most vulnerable. So please send us your questions on those topics. You can use Twitter with the hashtag ILC Daily Show, or on Facebook, use the comments section under the player.
Yes, please do post your questions, and in a short while we'll be hearing from Martin Earls, who is the ILO's Senior Specialist on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination. We'll also be joined a little while later on by Michelle Layton, who is the Chief of the ILO Migrant Branch. You can post your questions for both.
Thanks, Steve. But before we get to that, the plenary session of the ILC continued today. The plenary is the public forum of the ILC where governments and employer and worker representatives come together to discuss key world of work issues. Today we heard statements from 41 ILC delegates on the Director General's report to the conference. The conference committees also continued their work, including discussions on social protection and the application of ILO standards. Steve.
Thanks, Sophie. The COVID-19 crisis has had a huge effect on all of us, but for women, young people, migrants, and those in informal work, the impact has been truly disproportionate. Progress on gender equality has been set back, while the pandemic has also exacerbated discrimination against vulnerable groups in society.
So let's take a more detailed look at what needs to be done. First on gender equality, and next to improve inclusion for people with disabilities.
To discuss now how inequalities and discrimination can be addressed in the COVID-19 recovery, we're pleased to be joined by Martin Erlz. Martin is ILO's Senior Specialist on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination. He'll be taking some of our questions, so please post yours on Twitter using the hashtag ILC Daily Show or in the comment section under the player on Facebook. Martin, thank you very much for joining us. I wonder if we can start, if you could give us a little bit of background, set the scene for us a little bit. Just why has COVID-19 exacerbated inequalities and discrimination in the workplace so much?
Good afternoon and good morning, and thanks for having me for the show. It's great to be here. The videos that you have shown, they really put it right on there. The crisis has been extraordinary, affecting the lives of everybody. But as we know, certain groups in society have been falling back, have not been achieved the same levels of integration, of access to decent work. And the crisis has just bluntly made it very obvious that we have not yet succeeded in establishing equal opportunities and equal treatment for everybody. So while this is an entry point, I mean, we have to also see that the crisis has given setbacks. And so we need to catch up again, but we need to go beyond that and inform our future policies for a transformative agenda for equality, really by what we're seeing here. And in short, in response to your question, it's because people that are in a disadvantaged position, that are affected by exclusion or by inequality, they have been in a much weaker position actually to adapt and to cope with the crisis-imposed impacts, and as a result, often they are even in a weaker position right now as the result of the crisis.
Thanks, Martin. I'd like to ask you a question about gender equality. As countries prepare to build back better from COVID, how can we ensure that we do so in ways that support better gender equality?
That's actually very important. So we have seen that the crisis has required many of us to spend more time in unpaid work. For instance, caring for children or the elderly at home. And this is a task that has traditionally fallen the brunt of it on women. In the crisis, more men have taken up this. And that's a very welcome and very well needed, development. But we have to make sure that this is capitalized on, that we are capitalizing on this, leveraging this, and making sure that in the future we have better policies, better measures to lighten the burden for women and with family responsibilities, so they're being better able to engage in paid employment outside family responsibilities. So give one example. If we want to stick in some ways to the flexibility of teleworking that we have all been practicing, or many of us have been practicing, we need to make sure that we have the right policies in place and that those policies contribute to gender equality rather than undermining it.
Thanks, Martin. I have another question for you now. People with disabilities, Martin, have often found themselves disadvantaged, even during the best of times. Now, during the this crisis, what can be done to help that people with disabilities are not further disadvantaged and left behind during the recovery process?
Yes, again, I would say the crisis has given some opportunities to experiment with new forms of teleworking in the digital economy, and that's something that's also a future to create decent work opportunities for persons with disabilities. So that is one part. And the other one is also better policies and concrete measures to include persons with ability in the physical workplace. There is still issues about accessibility, but also issues about diversity and seeing the talents and assets of each and every one of us as things are, and hence allowing persons with disabilities to strive in the workplace and seeing them as members of societies as they see themselves. So this is something that we need to change further. The crisis has given us an opportunity to do so. We see some evidence that much more can be done in this area. And even in the ILO, we are moving ahead with better policies for disability inclusion, and many companies around the world are part of a global business disability network, and these are all very important avenues to make sure the disadvantages that persons with disability face from accessibility, but also from the quality of the jobs they do, including removing barriers for career advancements and accessing work at all levels. That is really a great chance that we have ahead of us, and it's very much needed, because we are not talking about the minority, we're talking about a large part of humanity, and so it's very important. And the goodwill that we have seen also in terms of solidarity during the crisis, people helping each other, that's something that we need to maintain and use to bring people together to discuss policies, to promote social dialogues, and to really make the needle move around these inclusion issues.
Thanks, Martin. Now, we've got some questions coming in on social media from our audience. One in particular from Maggie, who is watching us from India. So, hi, Maggie. She is asking for some specific recommendations on how to improve gender balance or get rid of gender discrimination in the workplace, both, I guess, for workers and employers. So could you give some specific ideas?
Yes, gender inequality is a very stubborn societal problem. It's rooted in the belief that men should do certain things, women should do certain things, and these things are assigned by societal patterns that change over time. What we have to do is to make sure that we're in sync with time. So that is something that needs an approach that's based on clear policies. So enterprises and workplaces can adopt policies and advance a climate of respect, dignity, and equal worth of all human beings in the workplace as a basis. So that's really at the basic there. But it goes down to very concrete things like work planning, in terms of how do you organize work. For instance, that allows workers also to cater to their family responsibilities. And that's something that should be available for and should be taken up by men and women in order to ensure also that the responsibilities that outside the workplace are increasingly shared. And it has to do also with very concrete things that need technical responses at the workplace, like, for instance, doing objective appraisals of jobs that are available in a company to make sure that jobs are remunerated in a fair manner and to avoid any discrimination of pay between men and women for work of equal value. So these are all very concrete examples what can be done. Obviously, there is also a need for a broader framework in terms of broader policies that the government is putting forward in terms of helping to avoid discrimination. So people that feel that they have been discriminated against have also access to justice and to remedies in those cases. So this is a couple of few examples how we can advance gender equality in the workplace. And I'll just conclude by that. It's very important that we also see the interconnections between gender-based discrimination and other forms of discrimination, including racial discrimination or discrimination against persons with disabilities or other characteristics, so that we see that we're moving more to a comprehensive and integrated approach also to ensure dignity in the workplace is in the end something that we need to enjoy decent work and to make sure that our work is productive and is beneficial for ourselves and for society as a whole.
Martin, thanks for that. Can I ask you just very briefly, if we have another question from Edmund in the USA, and Edmund is asking if a business wanted to employ people with disabilities, what steps could they take? Just in a very brief few words, Martin, what could they do?
Very often it's actually companies are asking, how do we find our pool of candidates? We want to promote access and inclusion, but where do we find our candidates? And that's a very good question. Obviously, want also persons that have the full skill set needed to do the job that's required from them. And so I think that needs a lot of attention in expanding the pool of candidates. And there is an increasing number of organizations, civil society organizations, or specialized agencies that help in that search of pool of candidates. So that's, I think, something that's very, very important. Of course, then when you think about advertising and reaching out to persons with disabilities, you have to make sure that this information is accessible, is available in an accessible form. So persons with disabilities, they might have some impairments, or to written materials, maybe have other types of access to that information. But then it's also about making the workplace in itself accessible from a physical point of view. And I'll say probably the most important is also to create an environment in which persons with disabilities can fully thrive. And that means that dealing with disability is not only an issue of helping individuals, but building a climate and an environment within a company or a workplace that is inclusive as such, and expanding the notions and stretching things. And we will realize that a lot of things that have to do with communication, with work organization, are not only important to include persons with special needs, but they are very important to create workplaces that have decent work and productivity for everybody. And so there is really a win-win situation to create these sort of environments.
Martin, thank you so much for joining us today. That was Martin Oltz, who is ILO Senior Specialist on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination. Now, it's time for another of our reports featuring ILO project managers around the world and their work. It's through these projects that we turn the decent work agenda into practical action and deliver positive change. Today we're going to hear from Pauline Swagi, who's in Nairobi, Kenya. Pauline is Chief Technical Advisor for the Innovation to Inclusion programme. The project works to improve access to waged employment for women and men with disabilities.
Capital and East Africa's business hub, a place of immense opportunities. But however, for persons with disability, obtaining these opportunities is an uphill task. My name is Pauline Swagi and I work for the International Labour Organization in Nairobi, Kenya, in a program known as Innovation to Inclusion. Through this program, the ILO is seeking to make systemic changes in the country that will result in better outcomes for the inclusion of persons with disability in the workplace. We are working with the government to ensure that disability data is integrated into all national employment and social protection systems, because we know that data is a driver of policy. Our key intervention, the Kenya Business and Disability Network, brings together employers from the private sector, building their confidence and building their capacity as well to ensure that persons with disability are able to access much needed opportunities for employment. We are also working with the unions through their collective bargaining framework in order to ensure that we accommodate fully persons with disability in the workplace. Our interventions in the country are working. We are seeing more partnership, more dialogue, and we are seeing a lot of activities towards inclusion being focused in the country. We look forward to a future where persons with disability are included in the world of work.
Thanks, Pauline, for sharing your video with us. We really appreciate the challenges of operating in the field during the COVID pandemic and how you're able to keep the good work of the Innovation to Inclusion programme going, a programme which is being delivered in partnership with the UK government. We'll bring you another video tomorrow. Sophie.
Thanks, Steve. Now, there are more than 164 million migrant workers worldwide. During the pandemic, many have been in frontline roles performing essential services. However, migrant workers often face inequality in the labour market. Even before COVID-19, discrimination and exclusion were issues, but the crisis seems to have made this worse. To look at why this is happening and what can be done, we're pleased to be joined now by Michelle Layton, who is Chief of the ILO's Migrant branch. Michelle, welcome. First, can I ask you, can you give us a bit more detail on how and why the pandemic has made the challenges facing migrant workers worse?
Yes, and thanks so much, Sophie, for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Certainly, we know the pandemic is having a brutal impact on economies and societies all over the world, but perhaps some of the most acutely affected are those who are migrant workers, and they're in vulnerable situations. They continue to suffer high job losses. Our assessments show that those in the low-skilled sectors have even had their contracts renegotiated with lower pay, required to work in very unhealthy conditions, suffer higher incidence of non-payment of wages. And unfortunately, we have received too many reports that migrants, particularly migrant domestic workers and women migrant workers, have been left stranded in some cases without even basic services, food and shelter, or access to social protection. So ILO has had to step up and working with other agencies really to provide support. It's been an extremely tragic year for so many.
Thanks, Michelle. Please may I ask, what action needs to be taken to protect migrant workers and ensure the reintegration of those who've had to return home during the crisis?
Well, certainly, migrant workers are facing, even before the pandemic, we're facing inadequate working and living conditions, low wages, paying huge recruitment fees, and then, of course, the lockdown of borders, which was for good reason, put a toll on tens of thousands who couldn't take up their jobs. But we also know that many were deported and millions returned home. And I think we have to start first with the response that it should be inclusive, it should be equitable, it should protect migrant workers and particularly their rights, and rights have to come first. The pandemic has really allowed, I think, some countries to re-examine the policies that exclude migrants from being able to access social protection. We saw some countries extending social protection and basic services to migrant workers, regularizing them so they didn't fall into irregularity and have to be deported. We also saw the extension of the allowance of changing jobs, and we're really hoping that these are going to be longer term, that they're not just during the pandemic. These would align well with international labor standards. But given that so many have returned home, millions, we do have an issue with reintegration into the labor market. And unfortunately, many of them are coming with these high debt burdens, some of course, because they've paid what we've documented is almost 17 months salary to get their job. And now they don't have a job and they're back in labor markets. Now, we also know that migrant workers bring skills and talents that can be tapped into, that can help rebuild labor markets. And so this is something that we're really supporting countries to look into now. Unfortunately, some of the systems in place are not adequate or up to the need to provide skills recognition that help migrants who are bringing these skills and talents reintegrate back into the market. That's an area to work on that we're working very closely with various institutions, public employment services, and the business community. But also, of course, their access to social protection, entrepreneurship training. All of these things are going to really help and make a difference in improving economic productivity and build back that is inclusive of migrant workers.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you for that. And let me pick you up on your last point. We know that migrant workers have performed a lot of frontline roles in the pandemic. As we now seek to build back better, how can we ensure that that process also includes more decent work opportunities for migrant workers? How do we deliver that to them?
Right. Well, I'm glad you raised that, Sophie. I mean, of course, not just here on the show, but around the world, there is a growing recognition of the important roles that migrant workers play in all sectors, but certainly on the front lines of this pandemic, in care work, as domestic workers, in agriculture, transport, so many areas. And yet we also know that they receive low wages. Typically, they are temporary or precarious work. They may not have the same pay or wages as their national workers, and yet they're doing the same job. And this is a paradigm that really has to be changed. Countries really can and they should do more to ensure that the responses to the pandemic are really equitable and inclusive, especially for those who are in vulnerable situations as migrant workers. Now, I think as we emerge from the pandemic, we can see that we may have the space for countries to rethink a better way for international migration to be governed, certainly looking to the migration and the recruitment systems that we want to see. I think those should be fairer, more gender responsive, and certainly rights-based. We can do that, and a first step, of course, is ratifying ILO standards and conventions. Those provide the foundation for good responses. But we also think that we've heard this word transformation so much during the ILC and elsewhere, and from many stakeholders. Engaging the social partners is really critical, especially in migration dialogue, and they're not often there. But they are on the front lines as workers and business, and they are really important and critical to making sure policies are sustainable. So as we move forward, we think obviously prioritizing those most vulnerable in the workforce is not only moving in the right direction, but a moral imperative.
Michelle, I'd like to now turn to a question from our audience, and this is one from Celeste, who is following us from Costa Rica. And Celeste asks, what are governments doing to protect migrant workers from COVID, and are they being included in national vaccination campaigns?
Well, this is an excellent question, Celeste. Governments are doing quite a lot in a number of areas. As I mentioned before, there are programs now that have been expanded to allow migrant workers who are out of jobs to take up jobs in other sectors. That's something that has not been prevalent in the regulations of migration and migrant work in the past in many countries. They've been prohibited from changing jobs. The loosening up of that has really helped migrant workers to access needed protections in the workplace with regular employment and then access to social protection. Some have expanded not only social protection, but the ability of migrant workers to access support services, access basic needs. Housing and living conditions have been raised as a critical issue around the world. Many migrant workers living in cramped situations are at much higher exposure rates than nationals to the COVID-19 infection. And this is really something that has, I think, opened the eyes of many who are looking at these issues and saying, we really have to change this, and we really have to provide adequate living arrangements. So it's catalyzed public momentum, government momentum in some countries. In other countries, not as much has been done. And as I say, we've seen some horrific tales and impacts to migrant workers. So it's been rather inconsistent and lumpy. And I think we really need to ensure that as we move forward in the future, we work with countries to keep some of these reforms and some of the recommendations we provided in our policy briefs to help implement those and ensure that whether migrants have been forced to return home, whether they're in destination countries, we eliminate discrimination and we promote equality of treatment in all areas, including in their wages, living conditions, access to medical care, and vaccines. And of course, as a member of the United Nations Network on migration, we with WHO and others have called for equal opportunity to access vaccines for migrant workers and all migrants and their families.
Thanks, Michelle. And I've got another question from social media, this time from Joseph in Zambia, who I think has been listening to what you said about the pay of migrant workers, because he would like to know, what is the ILO doing to ensure that migrant workers get paid the same as other workers for doing the same work?
Well, another important issue. I mean, we just released a global wage report on migrant workers, Joseph, and the numbers are startling. For migrant women, for example, their wage gap is 21%, when for national women it's 16%. Both are terrible, but it shows that migrant workers really suffer a wage penalty. So they're not only making less because they're women, but because they're migrant workers. And that tracks, of course, with men too. We know that in high-income countries, around 27% of migrant workers are on temporary contracts and likely to be in precarious work. That's not a tenable or sustainable situation. And the crisis has really, I think, threatened the inequalities in labor market differences between migrant workers. So we're running a risk that migrant workers and the strides we've made in the past are really going to go backwards, and that's going to affect wages and certainly working conditions. So we really have to address these issues by eliminating the inequalities in the workplace among migrant workers and nationals, especially those doing the same job. And ILO standards, of course, call for equal pay for work of equal value. We need to make that implemented and operational on the ground. We need to make that real. And that's got to be part of our commitment in the agenda moving forward.
Michelle, thank you so much for that, an important and difficult issue. That was Michelle Layton, who is Chief of the ILO's Migrant Branch. And that's pretty much all we've got time for on today's Daily Show. Tomorrow, the ILC's plenary discussions continue. They'll be broadcast live from 1300 CEST, that's 1100 GMT. And we'll be back with all the latest developments at 1630 CEST. That's 1430 for those of you outside GMT. Oh, sorry, that is 1430 GMT. Now, tomorrow's show will be a bit special. It will be dedicated to domestic workers. That's because it's 10 years since the adoption of Convention 189, the Domestic Workers Convention. And the 16th of June, the day the convention was adopted, is now marked as Domestic Workers' Day. The ILO is publishing new data on domestic workers around the world, and tomorrow's show will include interviews with our experts on the issue. So, if you have any questions on this important topic, please send them in. Once again, the ILO hashtag for Twitter is ILO Daily Show, and you can also post them on Facebook in the comments section.
And you'll also have different hosts with you tomorrow, who will be joined by ILO's Claire Hobden, who is the ILO specialist on the domestic work issue. So if you have any questions on domestic work, Claire Hobden is the lady to ask. But for now, it's goodbye from me here in Bangkok, and it's been a pleasure, as always, to present with you today, Sophie.
Thanks, Steve, and likewise, it has been a pleasure. And thank you to us all for joining us. For now, it's goodbye from all of us at the Daily Show team.